Today we are talking about the critical things that you really need to have in your pattern if you are marketing it as a beginner pattern. This is one of those things that I think a lot of people overlook because as quilters who are writing patterns, we tend to be a little bit more advanced and it's been a while since we've been a beginner. We forget what that was like. And so I think a lot of the patterns that are out there that are marked as beginner really should be marked as advanced beginner or confident beginner or something along those lines, right? Because you could not give this to a person who is making their very first quilt and they would be able to follow it, right? Like that. There is information missing and information assumed that beginner quilters just don't know. And so we're going to talk about kind of those things that I feel really, really need to be in a beginner pattern if you are truly serious about marketing this to beginners as if this was their first quilt pattern. So the first thing that is really, really important for beginner patterns is having kind of trimming diagrams for HSTs and QSTs. This is something that I think a ton of people take for granted. I've seen some patterns that don't even indicate that you have to trim. They just kind of assume that, which is not good because if you're doing like the 2 at a time method and you're not cutting in 1/8 increments, hands down, you're going to have to trim that thing. It's just the way that the math works out. So if you're a beginner quilter, you probably don't realize this. And certainly for QSTs, probably for HSTs, you don't really know how this is supposed to work. I remember one of the quilts that I made, this wasn't my first quilt, I think it was like my third or so, but I had never taken a formal class and I hated the thought of trimming, still do. And so, I just kind of looked it up online. I'm like, oh, okay, 4 at a time HSTs, no big deal, right? And oh my gosh, this thing was so wonky because I didn't even realize that you had to trim these things, that they were meant to be trimmed in order to get everything to work out. And so all of my HSTs and QSTs were completely wonky. None of the points matched. It was a learning experience. It took me forever to finish this quilt because it was super frustrating. I wanted my points to match. I'm a little bit of a perfectionist in that regard. And we don't want that for your customers, right? Beginner quilters are not going to have fun if they think the points are supposed to match and they can't get them to match no matter what they do. And a big part of that is trimming and making sure that it's trimmed properly. For HSTs, it's a little bit easier, but they may not realize they need to align that 45-degree diagonal. And so showing those trimming diagrams with those lines on their ruler highlighted and shown exactly where they're supposed to line up on the landmarks of the block is really important. But for QSTs, it's even more important because you have to align the center of that QST in a very specific point in order to get it to all work out. And so make sure you're including those trimming diagrams if you are marketing this towards a beginner. The next thing is making sure that you don't skip any assembly steps and you want to show them all on diagrams. So what I have here is a block coming together, and if you look closely, we've kind of skipped some steps, right? So first you would sew kind of these pieces together in doublets, and then you would sew all of those together into this kind of 6-part patch, right? And so there's a step in between here that's missing. And that's going to be really disorienting for a beginner quilter. More advanced quilters, right? Your brain fills in the steps. You know exactly where everything should go. It's a no-brainer, no big deal, right? Beginner quilters aren't going to realize that. And they're going to be like, wait, how did I get from here to here? This doesn't make any sense. What am I doing? Like, especially with HSTs where you kind of get that like bump once you've sewn those seams together, it's really important to show individual steps. Every single individual step. Don't skip any steps because that is really disorienting for a beginner. The next thing is showing points with seam allowances. So a lot of times as quilt pattern writers for HSTs, when you sew them together, kind of like I was talking about before, you get the diagonal seams kind of coming together and then there's like a little bump, right? And if you're a little bit more advanced as a quilter, you know that that's going to get eaten up when you sew the next piece together. And the seam allowance, that's important. You have to maintain those 1/4 inch seam allowances because we want the point to come to the edge of the block when it's finished, not necessarily in intermediate steps. Beginner quilters don't realize that. Especially on things like flying geese, like what you're seeing here. When they're trimming these things up, a lot of times they will trim exactly to that point and then they go into the next seam and now their tip's blunted because they've cut too far basically into that point and did not leave seam allowance. And so making sure that in your beginner patterns, you are showing every single step, but also what things are actually going to look like at those intermediate steps, rather than just kind of assuming that they understand there's supposed to be seam allowance there and not showing it because it's easier. Don't do that, right? You need to show the seam allowances, especially if it's something that's not intuitive or unexpected. One of those things is showing the offset in the seam allowance from points on your quilt at each of these intermediate steps. Now, I'll be honest, it gets a little bit onerous to show this at every single individual step. I get it, right? If you are writing for beginner patterns, that is the burden that you're taking on, unfortunately. Still needs to be shown. As you get kind of past these beginner patterns, your more advanced beginner, confident beginner, intermediate kind of level patterns, you don't need to show these things, right? You can just assume everything looks like a finished shape and roll with it. Quilters will be able to understand that. It's just these very, very, very beginner patterns that you need to show every single little bit of seam allowance so that people know exactly what to expect as they're sewing these pieces and make sure that they have sewn it correctly. The next really important thing is to show strip cutting units. Again, this is not something that a lot of beginners who have not taken formal classes will understand intuitively. Where are they making the alignments with their ruler on the strip set in order to cut the pieces? Are they trimming things up to begin with or not? Those kinds of questions. And so a lot of people will just say, hey, take this strip set and cut it down into 11 2.5-inch strips, right? That's fine for, a more advanced pattern. It's not good for a beginner. I've also seen a lot of people just kind of showing the strip set and then dashed lines with dimensions. Okay, great, but that doesn't really show you how you're actually supposed to make those cuts, which leaves a lot of room for interpretation from beginner quilters. And when you're just not familiar with this stuff and you're trying to figure it out, you can come up with some really creative ways to still follow the instructions, but make a totally different set of cuts than what was originally intended, and that'll screw up the entire pattern. So making sure that you're showing how do you align your ruler, how are you making this strip cut in your quilt pattern for a truly beginner pattern is really important. And then the last thing here is just kind of generally speaking along the lines of everything that I've showed thus far, but there's obviously many examples of this stuff. Basically anything that you would typically assume a quilter would understand in a quilt pattern, you need to show that and say it, describe it, show it in a diagram, explain it, something along those lines in a beginner pattern, because you cannot assume that your reader knows anything, because there is a very high likelihood that this might be the very first quilt they've ever made. And so things like stating the seam allowance, if a scant 1/4 inch is required, having some link to explaining what that is so that they can find out some more information, really, really important. Explaining how to cut things, explaining how to trim up blocks, things along those lines. You need to say it and show it rather than just expecting the reader to understand it intuitively. Now, this can end up adding a bunch of information to your quilt pattern, which makes it super long. And also, if you have quilters that are not beginners making this pattern, it can get frustrating for them. So a really great alternative to just kind of including all of this stuff written out in your quilt pattern is to put links to it, right? So if you've got a blog post about how to trim strip units, you can put a QR code to that if it's a print pattern, or just hyperlink it in your PDF digital patterns and be like, hey, if you haven't done this before, here's a quick tutorial on how to do it, right? And so beginner quilters can take advantage of those things if they need to, and it doesn't kind of pad your pattern with all of this excess information that can be really frustrating for more advanced quilters. It's there if the beginners need it, but it's not there for the people who don't need it. This also has the added advantage of kind of driving traffic and SEO improvements to your site. If you're trying to grow a YouTube channel, if you're trying to grow a blog, things along those lines to kind of help with additional marketing tactics, this can be a really great way to kind of direct your reader back to your website and kind of get them more information and get them more engaged with what you have to offer. Alrighty, I hope you found that helpful. If you did, make sure you like and subscribe, and I will be back next week with another Tech Tip Tuesday. See ya.